Chapter 16. Then began a curious phase in their lives, borrowings beyond all dreams of borrowing, a golden age. Every night the floor was opened, and treasures would appear. A real carpet for the sitting room, a tiny coal scuttle, a stiff little sofa with damask cushions, a double bed with a round bolster, a single ditto with a striped mattress, framed pictures instead of stamps, a kitchen stove which didn't work, but which looked lovely in the kitchen. There were oval tables and square tables, and a little desk with one drawer. There were 2 maple wardrobes, one with a looking glass, and a bureau with curved legs. Homily grew not only accustomed to the roof coming off, but even went so far as to suggest to Pod that he put the board on hinges. "It's just the hammering I don't care for," she explained. "It brings down the dirt." When the boy brought them a grand piano, Homily begged Pod to build a drawing room next to the sitting room, she said, and we could move the storerooms farther down. Then we could have those gilt chairs he talks about, and the palm in a pot. Pod, however, was a little tired of furniture removing. He was looking forward to the quiet evenings when he could doze at last beside the fire in his new red velvet chair. No sooner had he put a chest of drawers in one place when Homily, coming in and out at the door to get the effect, made him try it somewhere else. And every evening at about his usual bedtime, the roof would fly up and more stuff would arrive. But Homily was tireless, bright-eyed, and pink-cheeked. After a long day's pushing and pulling, she still would leave nothing until morning. "Let's just try it," she would beg, lifting up one end of a large doll's sideboard, so that Pod would have to lift the other. "It won't take a minute." But as Pod well knew, in actual fact, it would be several hours before, disheveled and aching, they finally dropped into bed. Even then Homily would sometimes hop out to have one last look. In the meantime, in payment for these riches, Arity would read to the boy every afternoon in the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He would lie on his back, and she would stand beside his shoulder and tell him when to turn the page. They were happy days to look back on afterwards, with the blue sky beyond the cherry boughs, the grasses softly stirring, and the boy's great ear listening beside her. She grew to know that ear quite well, with its curves and shadows and sunlit pinks and golds. Sometimes, as she grew bolder, she would lean against his shoulder. He was very still while she read to him, and always grateful. What worlds they would explore together, strange worlds to Arity. She learned a lot, and some of the things she learned were hard to accept. She was made to realize once and for all that this earth on which they lived turned about in space, did not revolve as she had believed, for the sake of little people. Not for big people either, she reminded the boy when she saw his secret smile. In the cool of the evening, Pod would come for her, a rather weary Pod, disheveled and dusty, to take her back for tea. And at home there would be an excited Homily and fresh delights to discover. "Shut your eyes," Homily would cry. "Now open them," and Arity, in a dream of joy, would see her home transformed. All kinds of surprises there were. Even one day, lace curtains at the grating, looped up with pink string. Their only sadness was that there was no one there to see, no visitors, no casual droppers in, no admiring cries and envious glances. What would Homily have not given for an overmantel or a harpsichord? Even a rain barrel would have been better than no one at all. "You write to your Uncle Henry," Homily suggested, "and tell him. A nice long letter. Mind, and don't leave anything out." Arity began the letter on the back of one of the discarded pieces of blotting paper, but it became, as she wrote it, just a dull list, far too long, like a sale catalogue or the inventory of a house to let. She would have to keep jumping up to count spoons or to look up words in the dictionary, and after a while she laid it aside. There was so much else to do, so many new books to read, and so much now that she could talk of with the boy. "He's been ill," she told her mother and father. "He's been here for the quiet and the country air, but soon he'll go back to India. Did you know," she asked the amazed Homily, "that the Arctic night lasts 6 months, and that the distance between the two poles is less than that between the two extremities of a diameter drawn through the equator?" Yes, they were happy days, and all would have been well, said Pod afterwards, if they had stuck to borrowing from the doll's house. No one in the human household seemed to remember it was there, and consequently nothing was missed. The drawing-room, however, could not help but be a temptation. It was so seldom used nowadays. There were so many knick-knack tables, which had been out of Pod's reach, and the boy of course could turn the key in the glass door of the cabinet. The silver violin he brought them first, and then the silver harp. It stood no higher than Pod's shoulder, and Pod restrung it with horsehair from the sofa in the morning room. A musical conversation. "That's what we could have," cried the exulting Homily, as Arity struck a tiny tuneless note on a horsehair string. "If only," she went on fervently, clasping her hands, "your father would start on the drawing-room." She curled her hair nearly every evening nowadays, and since the house was more or less straight, she would occasionally change for dinner into a satin dress. It hung like a sack, but Homily called it Grecian. "We could use your painted ceiling," she explained to Arity, "and there are quite enough of those toy builder's bricks to make a parquet floor." "Parquet," she would say, "parquet, just like a harpsichord." Even Great Aunt Sophie, right away upstairs in the littered grandeur of her bedroom, seemed distantly affected by a spirit of endeavor which seemed to flow in gleeful whirls and eddies about the staid old house. Several times lately Pod, when he went to her room, had found her out of bed. He went there nowadays, not to borrow, but to rest. The room, one might almost say, had become his club, a place to which he could go to get away from things. Pod was a little irked by his riches. He had never visualized, not in his wildest dreams, borrowing such as this. Homily, he felt, should call a halt. Surely now their home was grand enough. These jeweled snuff-boxes and diamond-encrusted miniatures, these filigree vanity cases and Dresden figurines, all, as he knew, from the drawing-room cabinet, were really not necessary. What was the good of a shepherdess nearly as tall as Arete, or an outsize candle snuffer, sitting just inside the fender, where he could warm his hands at the fire? He watched Aunt Sophie hobble slowly round the room on her 2 sticks. "She'll be downstairs soon, I shouldn't wonder," he thought glumly, hardly listening to her oft-told tale about a royal luncheon aboard a Russian yacht. Then she'll miss these things. It was not Aunt Sophie, however, who missed them first. It was Miss Driver. Miss Driver had never forgotten the trouble over Rosa Pighatchet. It had not been, at the time, easy to pinpoint the guilt. Even Crump Furl had felt under suspicion. From now on, Miss Driver had said, "I'll manage on me own. No more strange maids in this house, not if I'm to stay on meself. A drop of Madeira here, a pair of old stockings there, a handkerchief or so, an odd vest, or an occasional pair of gloves, these," Miss Driver felt, were different. These were within her rights. But trinkets out of the drawing-room cabinet, that, she told herself grimly, staring at the depleted shelves, was a different story altogether. She felt tricked. Standing there on that fateful day, in the spring sunshine, feather duster in hand, her little black eyes had become slits of anger and cunning. It was, she calculated, as though someone suspecting her dishonesty were trying to catch her out. But who could it be? Cramp Furl, that boy, the man who came to wind the clocks. These things had disappeared gradually, one by one. It was someone of that, she felt sure, who knew the house, and someone who wished her ill. Could it, she wondered suddenly, be the old lady herself? The old girl had been out of bed lately, and walking about her room. Might she not have come downstairs in the night, poking about with her stick, snooping and spying? Miss Driver remembered suddenly the empty Madeira bottle, and the 2 glasses which so often were left on the kitchen table. Ah, thought Miss Driver, was not this just the sort of thing she might do, the sort of thing she would cackle over, back upstairs again among her pillows, watching and waiting for Miss Driver to report the loss? "Everything all right downstairs, Driver." That's what she'd always say, and she would look at Miss Driver sideways, out of those wicked old eyes of hers. "I wouldn't put it past her," Miss Driver exclaimed aloud, gripping her feather duster as though it were a club. "And a nice merry andrew she'd look if I caught her at it, creeping about the downstairs rooms in the middle of the night." "All right, my lady," muttered Miss Driver grimly. "Pry and potter all you want. 2 can play at that game." Chapter 17. Miss Driver was short with Cramp Furl that evening. She would not sit down and drink with him as usual, but stumped about the kitchen, looking at him sideways every now and again out of the corners of her eyes. He seemed uneasy, as indeed he was. There was a kind of menace in her silence, a hidden something which no one could ignore. Even Aunt Sophie had felt it when Miss Driver brought up her wine. She heard it in the clink of the decanter against the glass as Miss Driver set down the tray, and in the rattle of the wooden ring as Miss Driver drew the curtains. It was in the tremble of the floorboards as Miss Driver crossed the room, and in the click of the latch as Miss Driver closed the door. "What's the matter with her now?" Aunt Sophie wondered vaguely, as delicately, ungreedily, she poured the first glass. The boy had felt it too, from the way Miss Driver had stared at him as he sat hunched in the bath, from the way she soaped the sponge, and the way she said, "And now." She had scrubbed him slowly, with a careful, angry steadiness, and all through the bathing time she did not say a word. When he was in bed she had gone through all his things, peering into cupboards and opening his drawers. She had pulled his suitcase out from under the wardrobe and found his dear dead mole and his hoard of sugar lumps, and her best potato knife. But even then she had not spoken. She had thrown the mole into the waste paper basket, and had made angry noises with her tongue. She pocketed the potato knife and all the sugar lumps. She had stared at him a moment before she turned the gas low. A strange stare it had been, more puzzled than accusing. Miss Driver slept above the scullery. She had her own back stairs. That night she did not undress. She set the alarm clock for midnight, and put it where the tick would not disturb her outside her door. She unbuttoned her tight shoes and crawled, grunting a little, under the eiderdown. She had barely closed her eyes, as she told Cramp Furl afterwards, when the clock shrilled off, chattering and rattling on its four thin legs, on the bare boards of the passageway. Miss Driver tumbled herself out of bed and fumbled her way to the door. "Shush," she said to the clock, as she felt for the catch. "Shush," and clasped it to her bosom. She stood there in her stockinged feet at the head of the scullery stairs. Something, it seemed, had flickered below, a hint of light. Miss Driver peered down the dark curve of the narrow stairway. Yes, there it was again. A moth-wing flutter. Candlelight. That's what it was. A moving candle beyond the stairs, beyond the scullery, somewhere within the kitchen. Clock in hand, Miss Driver creaked down the stairs in her stockinged feet, panting a little in her eagerness. There seemed a sigh in the darkness, an echo of movement, and it seemed to Miss Driver, standing there on the cold stone flags of the scullery, that this sound, that was barely a sound, could only mean one thing: the soft swing to of the green baize door, that door which led out of the kitchen into the main hall beyond. Hurriedly Miss Driver felt her way into the kitchen, and fumbled for matches along the ledge above the stove. She knocked off a pepper pot and a paper bag of cloves, and glancing quickly downwards saw a filament of light. She saw it in the second before she struck a match. A thread of light, it looked like, on the floor beside her feet. It ran in an oblong shape, outlining a rough square. Miss Driver gasped and lit the gas, and the room leapt up around her. She glanced quickly at the baize door. There seemed to her startled eye a quiver of movement in it, as though it had just swung to. She ran to it and pushed it open, but the passage beyond was still and dark, no flicker of shadow, nor sound of distant footfall. She let the door fall to again, and watched it as it swung back slowly, regretfully, held by its heavy spring. Yes, that was the sound she had heard from the scullery, that sighing whisper, like an indrawn breath. Cautiously clutching back her skirts, Miss Driver moved toward the stove. An object lay there, something pinkish, on the floor beside the jutting board. Ah, she realized, that board, that was where the light had come from. She hesitated and glanced about the kitchen. Everything else looked normal, and just as she had left it, the plates on the dresser, the saucepans on the wall, and the row of tea towels hanging symmetrically on their string above the stove. The pinkish object she saw now was a heart-shaped caoutchouc box, one that she knew well from the glassed-in tray table beside the fireplace in the drawing-room. She picked it up. It was enamel and gold, and set with tiny brilliants. "Well, she began, and stooping swiftly, with a sudden angry movement, she wrenched back the piece of floor. And then she shrieked, loud and long. She saw movement, a running, a scrambling, a fluttering. She heard a squeaking, a jabbering, and a gasping. Little people they looked like, with hands and feet, and mouths open. That's what they looked like, but they couldn't be that, of course. Running here, there, and everywhere. Oh, 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 she shrieked, and felt behind her for a chair. She clambered onto it, and it wobbled beneath her, and she climbed, still shrieking, from the chair to the table. And there she stood, marooned, crying and gasping, and calling out for help, until after hours it seemed, there was a rattling at the scullery door. Cramp Furl it was, roused at last by the light and the noise. "What is it?" he called. "Let me in." But Miss Driver would not leave the table. "A nest! A nest!" she shouted, alive and squeaking. Cramp Furl threw his weight against the door, and burst open the lock. He staggered, slightly dazed, into the kitchen, his corduroy trousers pulled on over his night-shirt. "Where?" he cried, his eyes wide beneath the tousled hair. "What sort of a nest?" Miss Driver, sobbing, still with fright, pointed at the floor. Cramp Furl walked over in his slow, deliberate way, and stared down. He saw a hole in the floor, lined and cluttered with small objects, children's toys, they looked like, Bits of rubbish, that was all. It's nothing, he said, after a moment. It's that boy. That's what it is. He stirred the contents with his foot, and all the partitions fell down. There ain't nothing alive in there. But I saw them, I tell you, gasped Miss Driver. Little people, like with hands, or mice dressed up. Cramp Furl stared into the hole. Mice, dressed up, he repeated uncertainly. Hundreds of them, went on Miss Driver, running and squeaking. I saw them, I tell you. Well, there ain't nothing there now, said Cramp Furl, and he gave a final stir round with his boot. Then they've run away, she cried, under the floor, up inside the walls. The place is alive with them. Well, said Cramp Furl stolidly, maybe, but if you ask me, I think it's that boy, where he hides things. His eye brightened, and he went down on one knee. Where he's got the ferret, I shouldn't wonder. Listen, cried Miss Driver, and there was a despairing note in her voice. You've got to listen. This wasn't no boy, and it wasn't no ferret. She reached for the back of the chair and lowered herself clumsily onto the floor. She came beside him to the edge of the hole. They had hands and faces, I tell you. Look, she said, pointing. See that? It's a bed. And now I come to think of it, one of 'em was in it. Now you come to think of it, said Cramp Furl. Yes, went on Miss Driver firmly. And there's something else I come to think of. Remember that girl, Rosa Pick-Hatchet, the one that was simple. Well, simple or not, she saw one on the drawing-room mantelpiece, with a beard. One what? Asked Cramp Furl. Miss Driver glared at him. What I've been telling you about. One of these. These. Mice dressed up, said Cramp Furl. Not mice, Miss Driver almost shouted. Mice don't have beards. But you said, began Cramp Furl. Yes, I know, I said it. Not that these had beards. But what would you call them? What could they be but mice? Not so loud, whispered Cramp Furl. You'll wake the house up. They can't hear, said Miss Driver. Not through the bays. Door. She went to the stove and picked up the fire tongs. And what if they do? We ain't done nothing. Moreover, she went on, and let me get at the hole. One by one Miss Driver picked things out, with many shocked gasps, cries of amazement, and did you ever? She made 2 piles on the floor, one of the valuables, and one of what she called rubbish. Curious objects dangled from the tongs. Would you believe it? Her best lace handkerchiefs. Look, here's another, and another, and my big mattress needle. I knew I had one. My silver thimble, if you please, and one of hers. And look, oh my, at the wools. The cottons. No wonder you can never find a spool of white cotton, if you want one. Potatoes, nuts. Look at this. A pot of caviar. Caviar. No, it's too much. It really is. Dolls' chairs, tables, and look at all this blotting paper. So that's where it goes. Oh, my goodness gracious, she cried suddenly, her eyes staring. What's this? Miss Driver laid down the tongs and leaned over the hole, tentatively and fearfully, as though afraid of being stung. It's a watch, an emerald watch, her watch, and she's never missed it. Her voice rose. "And it's going. Look, you can see by the kitchen clock. 25 past 12. Miss Driver sat down suddenly on a hard chair. Her eyes were staring and her face looked white and flabby, as though deflated. "You know what this means," she said to Crampfurl. "No," he said. "The police," said Miss Driver. "That's what this means. A case for the police." Chapter 18. The boy lay trembling a little beneath the bedclothes. The screwdriver was under his mattress. He had heard the alarm clock. He had heard Miss Driver exclaim on the stairs, and he had run. The candle on the table beside his bed still smelt a little, and the wax must still be warm. He lay there waiting, but they did not come upstairs. After hours, it seemed, he heard the hall clock strike 1. All seemed quiet below, and at last he slipped out of bed and crept along the passage to the head of the stairway. There he sat for a while, shivering a little, and gazing downwards into the darkened hall. There was no sound but the steady tick of the clock, and occasionally that shuffle or whisper which might be wind, but which, as he knew, was the sound of the house itself, the sigh of the tired floors and the ache of knotted wood. So quiet it was that at last he found courage to move and to tiptoe down the staircase and along the kitchen passage. He listened a while outside the baize door, and at length very gently he pushed it open. The kitchen was silent and filled with grayish darkness. He felt, as Miss Driver had done, along the shelf for the matches, and he struck a light. He saw the gaping hole in the floor and the objects piled beside it, and in the same flash he saw a candle on the shelf. He lit it clumsily, with trembling hands. Yes, there they lay, the contents of the little home, higgledy-piggledy, on the boards, and the tongs lay beside them. Miss Driver had carried away all she considered valuable, and had left the rubbish. And rubbish it looked, thrown down like this: balls of wool, old potatoes, odd pieces of doll's furniture, match-boxes, cotton spools, crumpled squares of blotting paper. He knelt down. The house itself was a shambles, partitions fallen, earth floors revealed, where Pod had dug down to give greater height to the rooms. Match sticks, an old cog wheel, onion skins, scattered bottle tops. The boy stared, blinking his eyelids, and tilting the candle so that the grease ran hot on his hand. Then he got up from his knees, and crossing the kitchen on tiptoe, he closed the scullery door. He came back to the hole, and, leaning down, he called softly, "Arity, Arity." After a while he called again. Something else felt hot on his hand. It was a tear from his eye. Angrily he brushed it away, and, leaning farther into the hole, he called once more. "Pod," he whispered, "homily." They appeared so quietly that at first, in the wavering light of the candle, he did not see them. Silent they stood, looking up at him with scared, white faces from what had been the passage outside the storerooms. "Where have you been?" asked the boy. Pod cleared his throat. "Up at the end of the passage, under the clock." "I've got to get you out," said the boy. "Where to?" asked Pod. I don't know. What about the attic? That ain't no good, said Pod. I heard them talking. They're going to get the police, and a cat, and the sanitary inspector, and the rat catcher from the town hall at Leeton Buzzard. They were all silent. Little eyes stared at big eyes. There won't be nowhere in the house that's safe, Pod said at last, and no one moved. What about the doll's house on the top shelf in the schoolroom? Suggested the boy. Even a cat can't get there. Homily gave a little moan of assent. Yes, she said, the doll's house. No, said Pod in the same expressionless voice. You can't live on a shelf. Maybe the cat can't get up, but no more can't you get down. You're stuck. You got to have water. I'd bring you water, said the boy. And there are beds and things here. He touched the pile of rubbish. No, said Pod, a shelf ain't no good. Besides, you'll be going soon, or so they say. Oh, Pod, pleaded Homily in a husky whisper. There's stairs in the doll's house, and 2 bedrooms, and a dining room, and a kitchen, and a bathroom, she said. But it's up by the ceiling, Pod explained wearily. You got to eat, haven't you? He asked, and drink. Yes, Pod, I know, but... There ain't no buts, said Pod. He drew a long breath. We got to emigrate, he said. Oh, moaned Homily softly, and Arity began to cry. Now don't take on, said Pod in a tired voice. Arity had covered her face with her hands, and her tears ran through her fingers. The boy watching saw them glisten in the candlelight. I'm not taking on, she gasped. I'm so happy. You mean, said the boy to Pod, but with one eye on Arity. You'll go to the Badger's set. He too felt a mounting excitement. Where else? Asked Pod. Oh, my goodness gracious, moaned Homily, and sat down on the broken matchbox chest of drawers. But you've got to go somewhere tonight, said the boy. You've got to go somewhere before tomorrow morning. Oh, my goodness gracious, moaned Homily again. He's right at that, said Pod. Can't cross them fields in the dark. Bad enough getting across them in daylight. I know, cried Arity. Her wet face glistened in the candlelight. It was alight and tremulous, and she raised her arms a little, as though about to fly, and she swayed as she balanced on her toe-tips. Let's go to the doll's house just for tonight and tomorrow. She closed her eyes against the brightness of the vision. Tomorrow the boy will take us, and she could not say to where. Take us, cried Homily in a strange hollow voice. How? In his pockets, chanted Arity. Won't you? Again she swayed, with lighted, upturned face. Yes, he said, and bring the luggage up afterwards, in a fish basket. Oh, my goodness, moaned Homily. I'll pick all the furniture out of this pile here, or most of it. They'll hardly notice, and anything else you want. Tea, murmured Homily. Enough for our lifetimes. All right, said the boy. I'll get a pound of tea, and coffee too if you like, and cooking pots and matches. You'll be all right, he said. But what do they eat? Wailed Homily. Caterpillars? Now, Homily, said Pod, don't be foolish. Luppy was always a good manager, but Luppy isn't there, said Homily. Berries. Do they eat berries? How do they cook? Out of doors? Now, Homily, said Pod, we'll see all that when we get there. I couldn't light a fire of sticks, said Homily. not in the wind. What if it rains? She asked. How do they cook in the rain? Now Homily, began Pod. He was beginning to lose patience, but Homily rushed on. Could you get us a couple of tins of sardines to take? She asked the boy, and some salt, and some candles, and matches, and could you bring us the carpets from the doll's house? Yes, said the boy, I could, of course I could. Anything you want. All right, said Homily. She still looked wild, partly because some of her hair had rolled out of the curlers, but she seemed appeased. How are you going to get us upstairs, up to the schoolroom? The boy looked down at his pocketless nightshirt. I'll carry you, he said. How? Asked Homily. In your hands. Yes, said the boy. I'd rather die, said Homily. I'd rather stay right here and be eaten by the rat-catcher from the town hall at Leighton Buzzard. The boy looked round the kitchen. He seemed bewildered. Shall I carry you in the clothespin bag? He asked at last. Seeing it hanging in its usual place on the handle of the scullery door. All right, said Homily, take out the clothespins first. But she walked into it bravely enough when he laid it out on the floor. It was soft and floppy and made of woven raffia. When he picked it up, Homily shrieked and clung to Pod and Arity. Oh, she gasped as the bag swayed a little. Oh, I can't. Stop it. Put me out. Oh, oh. And clutching and slipping, they fell into a tangle at the bottom. Be quiet, Homily, can't you? Exclaimed Pod angrily, and held her tightly by the ankle. It was not easy to control her, as he was lying on his back, with his face pushed forward on his chest, and one leg held upright by the side of the bag. Somewhere above his head, Arity climbed up, away from them, clinging to the knots of raffia, and looked out over the edge. Oh, I can't, cried Homily. Stop it, Pod, I'm dying. Tell him to put us down. Put us down, said Pod, in his patient way. Just for a moment, that's right, on the floor, and as once again the bag was placed beside the hole, they all ran out. Look here, said the boy unhappily to Homily, you've got to try. She'll try, all right, said Pod. Give her a breather, and take it slower, if you see what I mean. All right, agreed the boy, but there isn't much time. Come on, he said nervously. Hop in. Listen, cried Pod sharply, and froze. The boy, looking down, saw their 3 upturned faces catching the light. Like pebbles they looked, still and stony against the darkness within the hole, and then in a flash they were gone. The boards were empty and the hole was bare. He leaned into it. Pod, he called in a frantic whisper, Homily, come back. And then he too became frozen, stooped and rigid above the hole. The scullery door creaked open behind him. It was Miss Driver. She stood there silent, this time in her night dress. Turning, the boy stared up at her. Hello, he said, uncertainly, after a moment. She did not smile, but something lightened in her eyes, a malicious gleam, a look of triumph. She carried a candle which shone upwards on her face, streaking it strangely with light and shadow. "What are you doing down here?" she asked. He stared at her, but he did not speak. "Answer me," she said. "And what are you doing with the clothespin bag?" Still he stared at her, almost stupidly. "The clothespin bag," he repeated, and looked down as though surprised to see it in his hand. "Nothing," he said. "Was it you who put the watch in the hole?" "No," he said, staring up at her again. "It was there already." "Ah," she said and smiled. "So you knew it was there?" "No," he said. "I mean yes." "Do you know what you are?" asked Miss Driver, watching him closely. "You are a sneaking, thieving, noxious little dribbit of no good." His face quivered. "Why?" he said. "You know why. You're a wicked, black-hearted, fribbling little pickpocket. That's what you are, and so are they. They are nasty, little crafty, scampy, scurvy, squeaking little—" "No, they're not," he put in quickly. "And you're in league with them." She came across to him, and taking him by the upper arm she jerked him to his feet. "You know what they do with thieves?" she asked. "No," he said. "They lock them up. That's what they do with thieves, and that's what's going to happen to you." "I'm not a thief," cried the boy, his lips trembling. "I'm a borrower." "A what?" She swung him round by tightening the grip on his arm. "A borrower," he repeated. There were tears on his eyelids. He hoped they would not fall. "So that's what you call it," she exclaimed, as he had done so long ago, it seemed now, that day with Arity. "That's their name," he said. "The kind of people they are. They are borrowers." "Borrowers, eh?" repeated Miss Driver wonderingly. She laughed. "Well, they've done all the borrowing they're ever going to do in this house." She began to drag him toward the door. The tears spilled over his eyelids and ran down his cheeks. "Don't hurt them," he begged. "I'll move them, I promise. I know how." Miss Driver laughed again and pushed him roughly through the green baize door. "They'll be moved all right," she said. "Don't worry. The rat catcher will know how. Cramp Furl's old cat will know how. So will the sanitary inspector, and the fire brigade, if need be. The police'll know how. I shouldn't wonder. No need to worry about moving them. Once you've found the nest," she went on, dropping her voice to a vicious whisper as they passed Aunt Sophie's door, "the rest is easy." She pushed him into the schoolroom and locked the door, and he heard the boards of the passage creak beneath her tread. As satisfied, she moved away. He crept into bed then, because he was cold, and cried his heart out under the blankets. Chapter 19. "And that," said Miss May, laying down her crochet hook, "is really the end." Kate stared at her. "Oh, it can't be," she gasped. "Oh, please, please." "The last square," said Miss May, smoothing it out on her knee. "The 150th. Now we can sew them together." "Oh," said Kate, breathing again, "the quilt. I thought you meant the story." "It's the end of the story, too," said Miss May absently. "Or the beginning." He never saw them again, and she began to sort out the squares. "But," stammered Kate, "you can't, I mean. It's not fair," she cried. "It's cheating. It's—" Tears sprang to her eyes. She threw her work down on the table, and her crochet hook after it, and she kicked the bag of wools which lay beside her on the carpet. "Why, Kate, why?" Miss May looked genuinely surprised. "Something more must have happened," cried Kate angrily. "What about the rat-catcher, and the policeman, and the—" "But something more did happen," said Miss May. "A lot more happened. I'm going to tell you." "Then why did you say it was the end?" "Because," said Miss May. She still looked surprised. "He never saw them again." "Then how can there be more?" "Because," said Miss May, "there is more, a lot more." Kate glared at her. "All right," she said, "go on." Miss May looked back at her. "Kate," she said, after a moment, "stories never really end. They go on and on. It's just that sometimes at a certain point one stops telling them." "But not at this kind of point," said Kate. "Well, thread your needle," said Miss May, "with gray wool, this time, and we'll sew these squares together. I'll start at the top, and you can start at the bottom. First a gray square, then an emerald, then a pink, and so on." "Then you didn't really mean it," said Kate irritably, trying to push the folded wool through the narrow eye of the needle, "when you said he never saw them again." "But I did mean it," said Miss May. "I'm telling you just what happened. He had to leave suddenly at the end of the week because there was a boat for India and a family who could take him, and for the 3 days before he left they kept him locked up in those 2 rooms." "For 3 days!" exclaimed Kate. "Yes, Miss Driver. It seemed told Aunt Sophie that he had a cold. She was determined, you see, to keep him out of the way until she got rid of the borrowers." "And did she?" asked Kate. "I mean, did they all come? The policeman, and the rat-catcher, and the sanitary inspector didn't come. At least, not while my brother was there. And they didn't have the rat-catcher from the town hall, but they had the local man. The policeman came." Miss May laughed. "During those 3 days, Miss Driver used to give my brother a running commentary on what was going on below. She loved to grumble, and my brother, rendered harmless and shut away upstairs, became a kind of neutral. She used to bring his meals up, and on that first morning she brought all the doll's furniture up on the breakfast tray, and made my brother climb the shelves and put it back in the doll's house. It was then she told him about the policeman. Furious, he said she was. "Why?" asked Kate. "Because the policeman turned out to be Nellie Runacre's son, Ernie, a boy Miss Driver had chased many a time for stealing russet apples from the tree by the gate. A nasty thieving, good-for-nothing dribbit of no good, she told my brother. Sitting down there he is now, in the kitchen, large as life, with his notebook out, laughing fit to bust. 21, he says he is now, and as cheeky as you make 'em." "And was he?" asked Kate, round-eyed. "A dribbit of no good." "Of course not, any more than my brother was. Ernie Runacre was a fine, upstanding young man, and a credit to the police force, and he did not actually laugh at Miss Driver when she told him her story, but he gave her what Crumpfurl spoke of afterwards as an old-fashioned look, when she described homily in bed. Take more water with it, it seemed to say. More water with what? Asked Kate. The fine old pale Madeira, I suppose, said Miss May. And Great Aunt Sophie had the same suspicion. She was furious when she heard that Miss Driver had seen several little people, when she herself, on a full decanter, had only risen to one, or at most two. Cramp Furl had to bring all the Madeira up from the cellar and stack the cases against the wall in a corner of Aunt Sophie's bedroom, where, as she said, she could keep an eye on it. Did they get a cat? Asked Kate. Yes, they did, but that wasn't much of a success either. It was Cramp Furl's cat, a large yellow tom with white streaks in it. According to Miss Driver, it had only two ideas in its head: to get out of the house or into the larder. Talk of borrowers, Miss Driver would say, as she slammed down the fish pie for my brother's luncheon. That cat's a borrower, if ever there was one. Borrowed the fish. The cat did, and a good half-bowl of egg sauce. But the cat wasn't there long. The first thing the rat-catcher's terriers did was to chase it out of the house. There was a dreadful set-to. My brother said they chased it everywhere, upstairs and downstairs, in and out all the rooms, barking their heads off. The last glimpse my brother had of the cat was streaking away through the spinney and across the fields, with the terriers after it. Did they catch it? No, Miss May laughed. It was still there when I went, a year later, a little morose, but as fit as a fiddle. Tell about when you went. Oh, I wasn't there long, said Miss May, rather hastily, and after that the house was sold. My brother never went back. Kate stared at her suspiciously, pressing her needle against the center of her lower lip. So they never caught the little people, she said at last. Miss May's eyes flicked away. No, they never actually caught them, but, she hesitated, as far as my poor brother was concerned, what they did do seemed even worse. What did they do? Miss May laid down her work and stared for a moment thoughtfully at her idle hands. I hated the rat-catcher, she said suddenly. Why, did you know him? Everybody knew him. He had a wall eye, and his name was Rich William. He was also the pig killer, and, well, he did other things as well. He had a gun, a hatchet, a spade, a pickaxe, and a contraption with bellows for smoking things out. I don't know what the smoke was exactly, poison fumes of some kind, which he made himself from herbs and chemicals. I only remember the smell of it. It clung round the barns, or wherever he'd been. You can imagine what my brother felt on that third day, the day he was leaving, when suddenly he smelled that smell. He was all dressed and ready to go. The bags were packed, and down in the hall, Miss Driver came and unlocked the door and took him down the passage to Aunt Sophie. He stood there, stiff and pale, in gloves and overcoat, beside the curtained bed. Seasick already, Aunt Sophie mocked him, peering down at him over the edge of the great mattress. No, he said, it's that smell. Aunt Sophie lifted her nose. She sniffed. What smell is it, driver?" "It's the rat-catcher, my lady," explained Miss Driver, reddening, "down in the kitchen." "What!" exclaimed Aunt Sophie, "are you smoking them out?" And she began to laugh. "Oh dear," she gasped. "But if you don't like them, driver, the remedy's simple." "What is that, my lady?" asked Miss Driver coldly, but even her chins were red. Helpless with mirth, Aunt Sophie waved a ringed hand toward her. Her eyes were screwed up, and her shoulders shaking. "Keep the bottle corked," she managed at last, and motioned them weakly away. They heard her laughing still as they went on down the stairs. "She don't believe in them," muttered Miss Driver, and she tightened her grip on my brother's arm. "More fool her. She'll change her tune, like enough, when I take them up afterwards, laid out in sizes, on a clean piece of newspaper," and she dragged him roughly across the hall. The clock had been moved, exposing the wainscot, and, as my brother saw at once, the hole had been blocked and sealed. The front door was open, as usual, and the sunshine streamed in. The bags stood there beside the fiber mat, cooking a little in the golden warmth. The fruit trees beyond the bank had shed their petals and were lit with tender green, transparent in the sunlight. "Plenty of time," said Miss Driver, glancing up at the clock. "The cab's not due till 3:30. "The clock's stopped," said my brother. Miss Driver turned. She was wearing her hat and her best black coat, ready to take him to the station. She looked strange and tight and chapel-going, not a bit like Driver. "So it has," she said. Her jaw dropped, and her cheeks became heavy and pendulous. "It's moving it," she decided after a moment. "It'll be all right," she went on, "once we get it back. Mr. Frith comes on Monday," and she dragged again at his arm above the elbow. "Where are we going?" he asked, holding back. "Along to the kitchen. We've got a good 10 minutes. Don't you want to see them caught?" "No," he said, "no," and pulled away from her. Miss Driver stared at him, smiling a little. "I do," she said. "I'd like to see 'em close. He puffs this stuff in and they come running out. At least, that's how it works with rats. But first, he says, you block up all the exits." And her eyes followed his to the hole below the wainscot. "How did they find it?" the boy asked. Puttied it looked, and with a square of brown paper pasted on crooked. "Rich William found it. That's his job." "They could unstick that," said the boy after a moment. Miss Driver laughed. "Oh no, they couldn't. Cemented, that is. A great block of it, right inside, with a sheet of iron across from the front of that old stove in the outhouse. He and Cramp Furl had to have the morning room floor up to get at it. All Tuesday they was working up till tea time. We aren't going to have no more capers of that kind. Not under the clock. Once you get that clock back, it can't be moved again in a hurry. Not if you want it to keep time, it can't. See where it stood, where the floor's washed away like. It was then my brother saw, for the first and last time, that raised platform of unscrubbed stone. "Come on now," said Miss Driver, and took him by the arm. "We'll hear the cab from the kitchen." But the kitchen, as she dragged him past the baize door, seemed a babel of sound. No approaching cab could be heard here, with with yelps and barks and stampings and excited voices. "Steady, steady, 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 steady," Crampfurl was saying, on one loud note, as he held back the rat-catcher's terriers, which shrilled and panted on the leash. The policeman was there, Nellie Runacre's son, Ernie. He had come out of interest, and stood back from the others a little, in view of his calling, with a cup of tea in his hand, and his helmet pushed off his forehead. But his face was pink with boyish excitement, and he stirred the teaspoon round and round. "Seeing's believing," he said cheerfully to Miss Driver, when he saw her come in at the door. A boy from the village was there with a ferret. It kept sort of pouring out of his pocket, my brother said, and the boy kept pushing it back. Rich William himself was crouched on the floor by the hole. He had lighted something beneath a piece of sacking, and the stench of it smoldering eddied about the room. He was working the bellows now, with infinite care, stooping over them, rapt and tense. My brother stood there as though in a dream. Perhaps it was a dream. He said to me later, much later, after we were all grown up. He gazed round the kitchen. He saw the sunlit fruit trees through the window, and a bough of the cherry tree, which stood upon the bank. He saw the empty teacups on the table, with spoons stuck in them, and one without a saucer. He saw, propped against the wall, close beside the baize door, the rat-catcher's belongings, a frayed coat, patched with leather, a bundle of rabbit snares, 2 sacks, a spade, a gun, and a pickaxe. "Stand by now," Rich William was saying. There was a rising note of excitement in his voice, but he did not turn his head. Stand by, ready now to slip the dogs. Miss Driver let go my brother's arm, and moved toward the hole. "Keep back," said the rat-catcher, without turning. "Give us room," and Miss Driver backed nervously toward the table. She put a chair beside it, and half raised one knee, but lowered it again when she caught Ernie Runacre's mocking glance. "All right, Ma," he said, cocking one eyebrow. "We'll give you a leg up when the time comes." And Miss Driver threw him a furious look. She snatched up the 3 cups from the table, and stumped away with them, angrily into the scullery, seamless smutch of something or other. My brother heard her mutter as she brushed past him, and at those words, suddenly my brother came to life. He threw a quick glance about the kitchen. The men were absorbed. All eyes were on the rat-catcher, except those of the village boy, who was getting out his ferret. Stealthily, my brother drew off his gloves and began to move backwards, slowly, slowly toward the green baize door. As he moved, gently stuffing his gloves into his pocket, he kept his eyes on the group around the hole. He paused a moment beside the rat-catcher's tools and stretched out a weary, groping hand. His fingers closed, at last, on a wooden handle. Smooth it was, and worn with wear. He glanced down quickly to make sure. Yes, it was, as he hoped, the pickaxe. He leaned back a little and pushed almost imperceptibly against the door with his shoulders. It opened sweetly, in its silent way. Not one of the men had looked up. "Steady now," the rat-catcher was saying, stooping closely over the bellows. "It takes a moment like to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor." My brother slid through the barely opened door, and it sighed to behind him, closing out the noise. He took a few steps on tiptoe down the dark kitchen passage, and then he ran. There was the hall again, steeped in sunshine, with his bags beside the door. He bumped against the clock, and it struck a note, a trembling note, urgent and deep. He raised the pickaxe to the height of his shoulder and aimed a sideways blow at the hole below the wainscot. The paper tore, a few crumbs of plaster fell out, and the pickaxe rebounded sharply, jarring his hands. There was indeed iron behind the cement, something immovable. Again he struck, and again. The wainscot above the hole became split and scratched, and the paper hung down in strips, but still the pickaxe bounced. It was no good. His hands, wet with sweat, were sliding and slipping on the wood. He paused for breath, and looking out, he saw the cab. He saw it on the road, beyond the hedge, on the far side of the orchard. Soon it would reach the russet apple tree beside the gate. Soon it would turn into the drive. He glanced up at the clock. It was ticking steadily, the result, perhaps, of his knock. The sound gave him comfort and steadied his thumping heart. Time, that's what he needed, a little more time. It takes a moment, like the rat-catcher had said, to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor. Ventilation, that was the word, the saving word. Pickaxe in hand, my brother ran out of the door. He stumbled once on the gravel path and nearly fell. The pickaxe handle came up and struck him a sharp blow on the temple. Already, when he reached it, a thin filament of smoke was eddying out of the grating, and he thought, as he ran toward it, that there was a flicker of movement against the darkness between the bars, and that was where they would be, of course, to get the air. But he did not stop to make sure. Already he heard behind him the crunch of wheels on the gravel and the sound of the horse's hoofs. He was not, as I have told you, a very strong little boy, and he was only 9, not 10, as he boasted to Arity. But with 2 great blows on the brickwork, he dislodged one end of the grating. It fell down sideways, slightly on a slant, hanging, it seemed, by one nail. Then he clambered up the bank and threw the pickaxe with all his might into the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He remembered thinking as he stumbled back, sweaty and breathless, toward the cab, how that too, the loss of the pickaxe, would cause its own kind of trouble later. Chapter 20. "But," exclaimed Kate, "didn't he see them come out?" "No." Miss Driver came along then, in a flurry of annoyance, because they were late for the train. She bustled him into the cab, because she wanted to get back again. She said as fast as she could to be in at the death. Driver was like that. Kate was silent a moment, looking down. "So that is the end," she said at last. "Yes," said Miss May, "it could be, or the beginning." But Kate raised a worried face. "Perhaps they didn't escape through the grating." "Oh, they escaped all right," said Miss May lightly. "But how do you know?" "I just know," said Miss May. "But how did they get across those fields, with the cows and things, and the crows?" "They walked, I suppose. The Hinderies did it. People can do anything when they have a mind to." "But poor Homily, she'd be so upset." "Yes, she was upset," said Miss May. "And how would they know the way?" "By the gas pipe," said Miss May. "There's a kind of ridge all along, through the spinney and across the fields." "You see, when men dig a trench and put a pipe in it, all the earth they've dug out doesn't quite fit when they've put it back. The ground looks different. But poor Homily, she didn't have her tea, or her furniture, or her carpets, or anything. Do you suppose they took anything?" "Oh, people always grab something," said Miss May shortly. "The oddest things sometimes, if you've read about shipwrecks." She spoke hurriedly, as though she were tired of the subject. "Do be careful, child. Not gray next to pink. You'll have to unpick it." But went on Kate, in a despairing voice, as she picked up the scissors. "Homily would hate to arrive there, all poor and destitute, in front of Luppy." "Destitute," said Miss May patiently. "And Luppy wasn't there, remember? Luppy never came back. And you know what Homily would do. Can't you see her? She'd be in her element. She would tie on her apron at once and cry, 'These poor silly men!' And she'd bustle and fuss and cook and clean and make them wipe their feet when they came in." "On what?" asked Kate. "On a piece of moss, of course, laid down at the door." "Were they all boys?" Kate asked after a moment. "Yes, harpsichords and clocks, and they'd spoil Arity dreadfully." "What did they eat? Did they eat caterpillars, do you think?" "Oh, goodness, child, of course they didn't. They had a wonderful life, all that Arity had ever dreamed of. They could live very well. Badgers' setts are almost like villages, full of passages and chambers and storehouses. They could gather hazelnuts and beechnuts and chestnuts. They could gather corn, which they could store and grind into flour, just as humans do. It was all there for them. They didn't even have to plant it. They had honey. They could make elderflower tea and lime tea. They had hips and haws and blackberries and sloes and wild strawberries. The boys could fish in the stream, and a minnow to them would be as big as a mackerel is to you. They had birds' eggs, any amount of them, for custards and cakes and omelets. You see, they would know where to look for things, and they had greens and salads, of course. Think of a salad made of those tender shoots of young hawthorn. Bread and cheese, we used to call it, with sorrel and dandelion, and a sprinkling of thyme and wild garlic. Homily was a good cook, remember. It wasn't for nothing that the clocks had lived under the kitchen. But the danger, cried Kate, the weasels, and the crows, and the stoats, and all those things. Yes, agreed Miss May. Of course there was danger. There's danger everywhere, but no more for them than for many human beings. At least, they didn't have wars. And what about the early settlers in America, and those people who farm in the middle of the big game country in Africa, and on the edge of the jungles in India? They get to know the habits of the animals. Few animals kill for the sake of killing. Even rabbits know when a fox isn't hunting. They will run quite near him when he's full fed and lazing in the sun. These were boys, remember? They would learn to hunt for the pot and how to protect themselves. I don't suppose Arity and Homily would wander far afield. Arity would, said Kate. Yes, agreed Miss May, laughing. I suppose Arity might. So they'd have meat, said Kate. Yes, sometimes, but borrowers are borrowers, not killers, I think, said Miss May. That if a stoat, say, killed a partridge, they would borrow a leg, and if a fox killed a rabbit, they'd use the fur. Yes, for rugs and things. Supposing, said Kate, when they had a little roast, they skinned haws and baked them. Would they taste like browned potatoes? Perhaps, said Miss May, but they couldn't cook in the badger's set. I suppose they cooked out of doors. How would they keep warm then in winter? Do you know what I think? Said Miss May. She laid down her work and leaned forward a little. I think that they didn't live in the badger's set at all. I think they used it, with all its passages and storerooms, as a great honeycomb of an entrance hall. None but they would know the secret way through the tunnels which led at last to their home. Borrowers love passages, and they love gates, and they love to live a long way from their own front doors. Where would they live then? I was wondering, said Miss May, about the gas pipe. Oh, yes, cried Kate, I see what you mean. The soil's all soft and sandy up there. I think they'd go right through the badger's set and dig out a circular chamber level with the gas pipe, and off this chamber all around it there'd be little rooms, like cabins, and I think, said Miss May, that they'd bore 3 little pinholes in the gas pipe. One would be so tiny that you could hardly see it, and that one would be always alight. The other 2 would have stoppers in them, which, when they wanted to light the gas, they would pull out. They would light the bigger ones from the small burner. That's where they'd cook, and that would give them light. But would they be so clever? But they are clever, Miss May assured her. Very clever. Much too clever to live near a gas pipe and not use it. They're borrowers, remember. But they'd want a little air hole. Oh, said Miss May quickly, they did have one. How do you know? Asked Kate. Because once, when I was up there, I smelled hot pot. Oh, cried Kate excitedly. She twisted round and knelt up on the hassock. So you did go up there. So that's how you know. You saw them too. No, no, said Miss May, drawing back a little in her chair. I never saw them. Never. But you went up there. You know something. I can see you know. Yes, I went up there. Miss May stared back into Kate's eager face. Hesitant, she seemed. Almost a little guilty. Well, she conceded at last. I'll tell you, for what it's worth. When I went to stay in that house, it was just before Aunt Sophie went into the nursing home. I knew the place was going to be sold, so again, Miss May hesitated, almost shyly. Well, I took all the furniture out of the doll's house and put it in a pillowcase and took it up there. I bought things, too, out of my pocket money, tea and coffee beans, and salt and pepper and cloves, and a great packet of lump sugar, and I took a whole lot of little pieces of silk, which were over from making a patchwork quilt, and I took them some fish bones for needles. I took the tiny thimble I had got in a Christmas pudding, and a whole collection of scraps and cracker things I'd had in a chocolate box. But you never saw them. No, I never saw them. I sat for hours against the bank, below the hawthorn hedge. It was a lovely bank, twined with twisted hawthorn roots, and riddled with sandy holes, and there were wood violets, and primroses, and early campion. From the top of the bank you could see for miles across the fields. You could see the woods, and the valleys, and the twisting lanes. You could see the chimneys of the house. Perhaps it was the wrong place. I don't think so. Sitting there in the grass, half dreaming, and watching beetles and ants. I found an oak apple. It was smooth and polished and dry, and there was a hole bored in one side of it, and a slice off the top. The teapot, exclaimed Kate. I think so. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find the quill spout. I called then, down all the holes, as my brother had done, but no one answered. Next day, when I went up there, the pillowcase had gone, and everything in it. Yes, everything. I searched the ground for yards around, in case there might be a scrap of silk or a coffee bean, but there was nothing. Of course, somebody passing might just have picked it up and carried it away. That was the day, said Miss May, smiling, that I smelled hot pot. And which was the day, asked Kate, that you found Arity's diary? Miss May laid down her work. Kate, she began in a startled voice, and then uncertainly she smiled. What makes you say that? Her cheeks had become quite pink. I guessed, said Kate. I knew there was something you wouldn't tell me, like reading somebody else's diary. "It wasn't the diary," said Miss May hastily, but her cheeks had become even pinker. "It was the book called Memoranda, the book with blank pages. That's where she'd written it, and it wasn't on that day I found it, but 3 weeks later, the day before I left." Kate sat silent, staring at Miss May. After a while, she drew a long breath. "Then that proves it," she said finally. "Underground, chamber, and all." "Not quite," said Miss May. "Why not?" asked Kate. "Arity used to make her E's like little half-moons, with a stroke in the middle." "Well," said Kate. Miss May laughed, and took up her work again. "My brother did too," she said.